I think housing is so interesting. So we were really excited when we snagged Cea as a speaker for this week. And so for those of you who may not know her, Cea is a tenant organizer, urban planner, and she's working with Housing Justice for All. And she's been absolutely fundamental to the housing movement in New York City, as well as cancel rent throughout the pandemic, obviously, and has also played a really central role in tenant coalition laws to really strengthen New York State rent laws. But best of all, she's also a fellow DSA member. She's very involved with the Housing Justice Working Group, which I'm sure she'll tell you a little bit about or plug, which you can also get involved with. And we are so excited to have her speak with us. So I will toss it over to Cea.
Cool. Thank you for having me. That was a really kind introduction, and I'm excited to be here. For those of you who don't know me, I am a Central Brooklyn NYC DSA member, and I served on the steering committee of DSA for 2 years. I helped to found the Housing Working Group, which is now the Brooklyn Housing Working Group. And I've been organizing for tenants' rights in New York City for over a decade. So this is my first night school event. And if I tend to talk very quickly. So if whatever, just interrupt me and tell me to slow down if I'm talking too fast. And I'm gonna try to speak slowly, but I recognize that especially if I've been talking for a long time or I get excited, I just speed up. And I also want to thank you guys for coming on like a really beautiful spring day where I know everyone would much rather be outside. So yeah, I'm excited to get to the part of the discussion where we're going to do some Q&A. So we're going to get there. And I know the agenda includes some breakout groups too, if we make it happen. So let's get started. Before we do, I know this is a North Brooklyn event, so I just want to say a little bit about North Brooklyn and why it's important to ground a conversation about housing organizing where we actually live. So North Brooklyn is just really like ground zero of all the overlapping housing crises in New York. Both like Bushwick, East New York, and Greenpoint are made up of small unregulated apartment buildings. In unregulated apartment buildings, tenants face immense gentrification pressure, retaliation for organizing, both in conditions and rent hikes and eviction. Unregulated tenants and all tenants in North Brooklyn are facing gentrification pressure caused by speculative real estate and policies that enable them. And also sort of uniquely in North Brooklyn, compared to some other parts of Brooklyn, you really do see a tension between manufacturing and residential land uses, manufacturing and the drive to sort of keep high-paying manufacturing jobs in New York with the very high land values of residential real estate. And so this sort of unique zoning pressure to convert manufacturing land into commercial and residential real estate. So that tension to fight for good paying jobs as well as housing it feels very real in North Brooklyn. And then also really importantly, it is a diverse and working class and immigrant part of the city. And the reason why we've been able to retain that in the face of really truly immense housing pressures and affordability pressures is because there's such a high stock of public housing as well as limited equity cooperatives. And these types of housing are keeping North Brooklyn a really diverse and working class community in the face of really runaway gentrification. So to that point, I know folks did a lot of reading for this session, but I just want to drop one more article in the chat, which is about a group of, it just came out today, and it's about a group of working class immigrant tenants who are struggling against displacement in Greenpoint. And so after a 7-year court battle, they look like they are about to lose it and face eviction from their longtime home amidst a pandemic. So I just encourage you to check out this story and get involved because it touches on a lot of the tensions that we're going to be talking about today. And then the other thing I'm going to drop in the chat is just an article that I wrote a couple of months ago that is going to sort of form the basis for what I'm talking about today. So feel free to read it if you want to, but also don't because I'm about to say what it says out loud. So mostly what I'm going to talk about today is about tenant organizing and why it's so important, and it's a necessary precondition for social housing and expansion of public housing and all of the sort of housing as a human right things we want to see in and under socialism. We can't actually have housing as a human right without like an expansion of our commitment to tenant organization or tenant unionization, if you want to call it that. So that's mostly what I'm going to talk about today, is a sort of pretty recent history of the tenant movement, some of the contradictions that are arising, and what lessons we can take from that struggle. Sound good? Cool. Awesome. So in 2019, after really decades and decades of work, the New York State tenant movement scored what is really a generational victory. We passed an expansion of rent stabilization through what's called the Housing Stability and Tenant Protection Act of 2019. So this legislation expands rent stabilization to cover all of New York State. It rolls back key landlord-friendly provisions in our state's tenant protection laws. And these provisions were causing widespread housing unaffordability, encouraging real estate speculation, and if left unchecked, they would have caused rent stabilization to disappear completely through attrition. So what we were seeing is we were seeing units leave the regulated system, become market rate apartments, and we were seeing a total loss of regulated and rent controlled apartments. It was a huge victory. It was shocking to many people, both on the tenant side and on the real estate side. It was like a little sort of surprising how much the tenant movement was able to win. And really just 2 years later, a little less than 2 years later, the tenant movement is really at a crossroads. Hundreds of thousands of people have lived without income for over a year. Folks have little confidence in their ability to make next month's rent. A subset of those tenants are, including many DSA members, are actively withholding their rent because they can't pay, because they won't pay, or both. And it sort of has amounted to the largest coordinated rent strike in decades. We are also fighting for much bolder demands to fully cancel the rent. And at the same time, as we are immensely mobilizing in the streets, that demand is really, really polarizing in the legislature. It's polarizing amongst small landlords and working class homeowners, people who we probably want to organize alongside, potentially. And it is polarizing among some of the same champions, both inside and outside the legislature, who ushered in the HSTPA. So as much as it is this demand to cancel rent has both spurred a huge outside movement of renters, it has really failed to get traction in the state legislature, and we have not been able to generate the same sort of political power behind it as we were behind the HSTPA. And so even after a wave of primary victories in 2020, this campaign to cancel rent is coming to a close next week as the legislature negotiates the final New York State budget with a relatively boring compromise that will avert mass evictions. I'll say more about this later, but not really fundamentally challenge the status quo of real estate control over our homes. And so we'll circle back around to this, but I want to just talk a little bit today about like what are the lessons from the 2019 fight to expand the HSTPA and the fight to cancel rent, and what we can learn about the fight for social housing and the fight for housing as a human right, and what housing should look like under socialism from these two things. So New York City DSA was deeply involved in the campaign for universal rent control in 2019. The Tenant Organizing, which was the campaign for universal rent control, the Tenant Organizing campaign to expand rent regulation. In addition to fighting to elect Julia, who represents North Brooklyn and who was one of the architects of the legislative package that passed, our housing working group trained hundreds of New York City DSA members on their rights as a tenant. We trained them on DSA members on how to organize their buildings and to get directly engaged in struggles both against their landlords and the politicians who back landlords in Albany. And so this nexus of real estate backing politics is sort of like core to our strategy on how we are trying to like win stronger tenant protections in New York. And we decided that fighting for rent control was a strategic and critical first step in the fight for full social housing. So a lot of times people ask, why are we fighting for rent control when we have NYCHA? We should be fighting to like save our public housing. We decided that through a program like rent control, we are able to sort of directly challenge the logic of unfettered profit in the real estate market. And we are able to directly challenge housing as a wealth building tool, and through regulation, strike a blow to the entire real estate industry at once. And so the beauty of rent stabilization and rent control is that it weakens the speculative value of the real estate asset. The value is no longer based on what the landlord is able to get, but rather it's based on a state public board who's deciding how much rent is going up. And yes, that board is controlled by the real estate industry. And yes, there could be a better way to regulate it. But the idea is that we could weaken the entire industry at once through a strong rent control campaign, and that would strengthen our ability to do things like fight for social housing. And I think that was the right decision. So in order to win the universal rent control campaign, we got into coalition with a broad-based group of dozens of housing justice organizations from across the state of New York. For years, we had been really on the defensive as a housing justice movement, fighting to protect the system, to close loopholes that were causing the attrition. But in 2017 and 2018, in the run-up to 2019, we opted instead to go on the offensive, which we really did in 3 ways. First, we opted to make really bold demands with a mass unifying narrative and a unifying appeal. So instead of fighting for repealing the preferential rent loophole, which is a very small wonky thing, we said, we want universal rent control. We want every tenant to have the right to renew their lease at a limited rent increase with the right to organize. And so that was a sort of strategic decision to be fighting for something that people could see themselves in. And instead of being on the defensive, we wanted every tenant in New York State to have some basic rights. The second is that we really grounded the campaign in movement building and organizing. And our strategy was to expand the base of people fighting for changes to rent control. And so notably, the 2 groups of people that we made an explicit effort to get organized included unregulated tenants and homeless New Yorkers, as well as this is sort of in the category of unregulated renters, but renters who live in upstate New York. And so we weren't just talking about the 5 boroughs, we were really trying to build political representation from across the state and bring new people who had never been organized for into movement. And so finally, we really did want to take dead aim at the role that real estate plays in politics. The election of Julia Salazar is a huge part of this, but the election of Julia Salazar was exciting because we talked to thousands and thousands of people on the doors every single day about the role that real estate plays in New York State politics, and really polarized. We made the entire election cycle in 2018 around real estate money. So these 3 strategy changes all drive towards one overarching strategy, which is we need to bring more people into movement. We cannot have housing as a human right or housing under socialism unless we are better organized as a base of tenants. And the fight for socialism for us is about who owns and controls critical resources like land and housing. And if we are not actually talking to people about that, if we're just allowing housing to be an individual wealth building tool where we are just sort of sitting around trying to become homeowners, where we're just struggling under our mortgage payment, or not organized as renters, we're not actually building collective ownership and the kinds of housing that we would have under socialism. So organizing is a precondition for more public housing, and it's a precondition for more social housing. And the best way to do that is by organizing unregulated or rent stabilized renters, in our estimation. So expanding the size of the movement also meant getting real about some of the shifting demographics in the movement. Just to take a sort of recent view, I mean, historically, it's been a little bit different than this, but in recent years, New York's renter justice movement has been primarily led by Black women and Latinx women. And then for centuries, really racist housing policy at every level of government encouraged white and middle-class home ownership. that was based on the exclusion and otherization of Black families. And Black families would rent, or as a result, Black families and Latinx families are far, far, far more likely than white New Yorkers to be long-term renters. And so that has for many years been the makeup of the housing justice movement. Today, though, that is different. Renting is on the rise in every part of the country, including in New York City, where it's always been high. And millennials of every race are far, far, far less likely than their parents to become homeowners. That's just a reality, maybe because of the subprime mortgage crisis, 2008, 2010, the massive medical debt, the massive student loan debt crisis. For a lot of reasons, people of my generation are not running out and getting mortgages to the same degree that our parents were. And so, yeah, so that means that the multiracial middle class and working class that are millennials are joining the renter justice movement, right? So people are waking up across the country and across New York to the sort of deep injustices of a housing market that is only built on homeownership. And so while renters' rights have always been a priority in New York for people of color, today there's a new crop of tenant organizers, including DSA members, that is multiracial but whiter than previous generations. And that's sort of changing the political dynamics as well. In addition to this, there's a shift in the organizational composition of the housing justice movement. So it's typically been made up of neighborhood-based organizations, many of which emerged in the 1970s in defiance of white flight and capital abandonment in the city. So these organizations work to take over housing for themselves. They are today not-for-profit, affordable housing providers, landlords, who manage low-income housing that is subsidized by the city and the state. And that transition in the 1970s, the 1980s, and the 1990s from insurgent community organizations to basically not-for-profit landlords really had a cost for the tenant movement, a deep one. And it's one that we need to really grapple with as we think about what it would mean to take control over land actually. And so this gets back to this point, why are we fighting for rent control and we're not fighting for community land trusts? So I'll circle back around to that in a second. But these organizations now rely on a combination of rental income from their base constituency and federal, state, and city resources, a deep connection to the political establishment. And it meant that they are a lot less likely to support bold demands like cancel rent, whereas they were a lot more comfortable with demands like reform preferential rent. So starting in 2019, though, the tenant organizing movement really committed itself to movement building and orienting itself not just to these neighborhood-based organizations who we don't want to abandon, right? They're a part of the movement, but orienting ourselves towards, I would say, mass social movement organizations like New York City DSA, and also various Black Lives Matter formations. And these organizations are just less tethered to the political establishment and have fewer imperatives connected to neighborhood-based service provision, or actually like collecting rent from the base. So this sort of shift in the movement from a movement that was made up of pretty established and politically connected housing justice organizations did help us win in 2019, but it has also not carried with us into the fight to cancel rent, as we have seen. So to sort of bring us to today and what's happening with the cancel rent movement right now, while there was like deep, broad support for the reforms of universal rent control, the organizations at the table, the tenant unions, the anti-poverty service providers, the neighborhood-based organizations, and labor unions even likely came to that table for rent control for pretty different reasons. Some of the not-for-profit landlords were seeing their sort of relevancy erode. if they no longer could compete with some of the mission-oriented landlords, were unable to compete with larger and more speculative landlords in the real estate market, and they were losing control and footholds in the neighborhoods that they had set a stake in, literally, many, many decades ago. Legal services providers and some more traditional anti-poverty organizations support protecting rent stabilization because rent stabilization provides a lot more housing to low-income people than any other single government means-tested program. And then tenant unions and NYC DSA and socialists support rent stabilization because it represents a widespread transfer of wealth and power from landlords and renters to the public. And it allows the public to set rent increases and not the market. And so we all were coming to rent control for different reasons, but those reasons have not stuck with us into the campaign to cancel rent. Like rent stabilization, the demand to cancel rent questions the right to profit off of real estate, particularly in the middle of the pandemic. And rather than a more narrow and technocratic conversation about affordability, we're sort of explicitly envisioning a world that's free from landlord domination and rent seeking. And it's really popular amongst tenants, and it's really viewed with skepticism amongst decision makers. And we haven't organized enough to get the momentum to just cancel the rent. Cancel rent, to me, the promise of cancel rent is that it does two things. The first is it's providing immediate relief during the pandemic, the moment that we're in right now, but it also transitions us to social housing. And the way that it does that is it actually is having sort of the resources to maintain the housing are coming in at the level of the landlord instead of at the individualized level. So it's sort of like getting to this question of, yes, we're going to regulate housing. We're going to make sure that housing stays affordable to people who live there. Yeah, we're going to pay for it. But in exchange, we're going to get something. And so it allows us to really put conditions on the receipt of public resources for housing that are not possible if it's just at the individualized tenant level. But we didn't get there. We didn't win it. At the beginning of the pandemic, we predicted that the real estate industry would restructure in response to COVID-19. And it would look 1, 2, or 3 different ways, essentially. In the first scenario, New York State would fail to act at all. And that would lead to a humanitarian eviction crisis, mass evictions and homelessness, millions of people unable to pay the rent, a foreclosure crisis in the real estate industry. Smaller and mid-sized landlords would exit the housing market, and the real estate industry would consolidate more into the hands of finance capital. The Blackstone Group announced in April last year that it set aside $21 billion to invest in housing because as prices fall and the market falters, Blackstone sees that as an opportunity. The second path we always predicted would be the most likely, and that's the one that's likely to pass in Albany this week, which is a voucher-based rent relief program where the government is providing renters with money to pay a portion of their rent. And you know what this does is it averts mass evictions. It alleviates immediate pain, but it entrenches a market-based system of providing affordable housing, but it doesn't shift any power away from real estate towards tenants. And it doesn't shift the exploitative landlord-tenant relationship at all. And the third and final path, which is both the promises and the failure of the cancel rent movement, is that New York State would leverage its weakness in the real estate industry to build on the victories of 2019, further decommodify housing, take this moment of weakness and like capture a lot of units of housing and bring them into other sort of decommodified and socially controlled and collectively run sort of models of ownership. And we could do that through canceling rent, closing eviction courts, and using state action and state resources to acquire properties, leverage disinvestment, and convert thousands of homes into publicly and democratically controlled housing. We're not doing that. It would have been really awesome. But what we are doing is a second path. So, you know, while there is some good to that, right? People will be protected from eviction, there is going to be a sort of social safety net that exists for the time being. It's not a solution that, you know, in my mind meets the scale of this moment, and it's not a solution that challenges the logic of our existing housing framework. So while we're unlikely to win cancel rent this year, the campaign has really not overall been a failure. We have kept housing courts closed for almost an entire year in New York State. There was just an article this week that there has been, since March of 2020, just 9 legal evictions in New York City, which is a tremendous victory for the housing movement. And that has never happened before, to my knowledge, in New York State's history at all. So congratulations to all of us. And the only reason why we got that is through organizing and constant pressure to keep the courts closed. But we didn't have enough power or enough tenant organization to make the claim that we could credibly take over this housing and run it ourselves through this moment of cancel rent, or that we could force landlords into different types of regulatory agreements through this moment of cancel rent. We didn't have enough power to make that feel real to people. So that we'll just give tenants money to pay their landlords rent. So I think it's a little bit of a failure of radical imagination on the part of the state's bureaucrats, but a lot of it about the lack of tenant unionization and tenant organization that is a precondition to make models of ownership and housing models like that function. So what are some of the lessons that I want to make sure that, you know, we take from this moment into the next moment? The first is that, as we really saw with the history of CDCs, these community development groups were just completely willing to turn their backs on this exciting and insurgent housing justice movement in a really sort of critical and generational defining moment, the last year of the COVID-19 housing justice crisis. And the reason, I think, is because those organizations, while they provide an immense amount of good, face an immense amount of contradictions that they were really unable to overcome. And the reason that they were unable to overcome them is that largely they committed to the housing provision side of the work and not the democratic governance and commitment to tenant organizing side of the work. And so that can't be a afterthought. And it can't be an afterthought because without it, any community land trust or any sort of form of social housing that we manage to create for ourselves is going to be subject to those same contradictions and challenges. The second question, or the sort of related point, is that NYCHA faces some of these exact same challenges. NYCHA is failing to, NYCHA, I would say, is a tremendous resource and so critical to New York City. But, you know, the part of the reason why we have been unable to really win resources for public housing, and part of the reason why NYCHA is unable to inspire deep confidence, is that there's a real lack of trust in NYCHA residents of NYCHA, right? So NYCHA is a deeply valuable and fully decommodified resource that has not committed in the democratic governance and management side of social housing whatsoever. And so without tenant organization in NYCHA, we don't have anyone who's going to fight for NYCHA when it's falling apart. And that's not totally true. Like there are pockets of very important organizing happening in public housing, but the reality is that without a commitment to engaging public housing residents in the management of public housing, we don't have the right base of people who are actually going to be able to win the investment and create the political will to prevent NYCHA from falling apart. And so for me, the question of the sort of lesson, the biggest lesson of the last year, from cancel rent to the fight to invest in public housing to the question of the community development organizations, is that really the left needs to get super serious in housing about what collective governance over our land and our resources looks like. And rent control is a path to get there. And we need a much, much higher level of tenant unionization and tenant organization in order to win the things that we're talking about. Without it, we're going to create not-for-profit housing or public housing, but not social housing. And we need social housing in order to have housing as a human right. And so that's not just like an organizational flow chart or like this person is control of this resources and this person's writing the grants or whatever. It's like actually self-organization at the building and the block and the neighborhood level, and constant work to bring people into movement and keeping people organized. And if we do that and we commit to being really political about tenant organizing and tenant unionization, I think we'll be able to tackle some of the other questions that the left, I think, tends to duck, which is the question of smart and green and socialist infrastructure and growth. We have a really tremendous opportunity in the next infrastructure package. Biden is saying now what he's going to do, like 1 million units of green affordable housing across the United States. Like, what does that mean? What is that going to look like? The left in New York tends to sort of hate the question of new development. And we hate the question of new development because of who's in the driver's seat. It is constantly and always the real estate industry. But, with a deeper commitment to organizing, we could be in the driver's seat ourselves, and we have to get really serious about what that looks like in order to get serious about solving the homelessness crisis, tackling the question of green infrastructure, tackling the question of like, what are we going to do to build more housing in a city that is growing. So that's all that I have. And I'm excited to do some Q&A.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Cea. I'm sure people have lots of good questions. So just before we jump to that, Obi, if you want to cover community agreements real quick.
Hi, Cea, thank you very much. First, everyone is here to learn, and please assume good intentions and be comradely. Stack where everyone introduced themselves in the chat. Write stack if you have a question, like I just did and Doug just did. And once you put your stack there, we'll call on you. And once we do, please be brief and keep your question under 30 seconds and don't ask multi-tiered questions. If you have multiple questions, please jump back on stack and keep context and anecdotes to a minimum. And I'll pass it back. I'll pass it to Ashley.
Yeah, okay. Sure, and just so everyone knows, I'll try to keep Stack as progressive as I can and prioritize voices from people with identities that are usually marginalized. With that being said, Obi, do you want to go first?
Cool. So first of all, like I said, thank you very much for the talk. And what you were saying reminded me of something from the National Review, and they were saying that basically the moratorium on rents is like theft, state sanctioned theft. And they were saying that, the government doesn't own all of the rents, and this rent is owned to private people, and it's not fair. And I have a friend who's in landlord and he's not getting anything. So, I have a tendency sometimes to feel a bit sympathy for him. So what do you say to that? Is this theft? Is this wrong?
So there's a lot of different ways I would answer that question depending on the audience. Here, it's not wrong. We know that eviction moratoriums during a pandemic have saved hundreds of thousands of people's lives. And so the question is, like, if people can't afford rent, do you want them to live or not? And so we just have to get real that housing is healthcare. And during a pandemic, our homes are like the only thing that is keeping us safe from the virus. And people have to be able to stay at home. The second thing is that nobody is guaranteed profit. there are millions of people who have lost jobs and income during this pandemic, right? That has to include landlords. And I don't think that that's fair. I hate that lots of people lost their jobs, and I wish that people would get the income that they need from the government in order to pay for their cost of living. But nobody made you become a landlord, and nobody is guaranteeing you profit. And then the third thing I would say, which is actually the most true and the least soundbitey, is that it's through government action that millions of white people have been able to generate wealth through housing and land. And it is through government action that your friend might even be a landlord to begin with, right? And so we need to get really serious about what role we want the government to play. And right now, the government is playing a role that is about protecting property rights. And we want the government to play the role that's protecting a human right to housing. And so I actually don't want to see, that's complicated, right? Because we have a very weak social safety net, right? And because our homes are, the only source of wealth for like 40% of Americans, and we don't have we don't have universal health care, and we don't have high quality, higher public education, and we don't have a lot of the things that housing becomes a stand-in for. So you like mortgage your home to pay for your mother's retirement, or you mortgage your home to pay for your kid to go to college, or you mortgage your home to like, I don't know, you break your leg skiing or something like that. I don't know what happens, but your home becomes a stand-in for like every major expense that you might face. And so that's why it gets complicated. And so what I would say to your friend is like, yeah, I think that like, it's not fair that they don't have the things that they need to live. And also, you shouldn't be getting the things that you need to live based on a poor renter who can barely afford to make rent before the pandemic. You should be getting the things that you need to live because they should be guaranteed to you. So it's complicated, and I recognize that it's complicated, but we shouldn't be in a society where we're sort of just balancing the things that we need to live off people who are maybe less fortunate than us.
Awesome. Next, we're going to have Mia.
Okay, I'm still trying to formulate my question in my head a little bit, so hopefully it makes sense. But I was just wondering, like, thinking from the perspective of like persuasion and the extent to which we do have to like convince like a mass amount of people to support, say, like cancel rent or even just like universal housing, whatever the demand is. Are there like any, I guess, major common myths that you've seen about like, say, rent cancellation or public housing that are maybe easily addressable, or are there ones that are maybe like a little bit trickier when it comes to, yeah, like say the small landlord question or whatever, like the one building kind of landlord owner, which is maybe similar to Obi's question. Yeah, does that make sense?
Totally, yeah. So I think the biggest myth about cancel rent is that we just want to force landlords to bear the cost of the crisis. And we don't want landlords to bear the cost of the crisis, especially not mom and pop landlords. What we like about cancel rent is that it's the only policy that I've seen so far that doesn't treat all landlords the same. So essentially what it's doing is it's putting the level of means testing onto the property owner and not onto the renter. So under our current conditions, you, the individual, have to go and like prove your worth and prove how much you need help and promise that you're never going to do anything wrong or at all deviant, and then you'll get like a rental assistance voucher. We want to sort of flip that paradigm and say like rent support is coming to people universally. If you can't afford the rent, the government's going to like make sure that you have a safe place to live. And the way that we're going to do that is we're going to ask landlords to go to the state and say, this is how much rent I haven't been able to collect in the last year. And this is, I'm going to open my books. And when I open my books, the landlord would be able to, the state would be able to see, okay, like, we're not going to guarantee you like 300% profit. Maybe we'll guarantee you like a 6% profit, enough to like live, maintain the properties, and take care of your building. That's so 6% was sort of the formula the Mitchell-Lama program is based on. So there's some historic precedent there. But the myth is not that landlords are not getting any money, or the myth that I want to push back on, it's not that landlords are not going to get paid. We want them to get paid. We just don't want to guarantee an exorbitant amount of profit, which is something that other types of systems do. And we want to recognize that over many, many decades, landlords have been able to get a lot of value out of the real estate market that tenants have not been able to get. And so we want to recognize that too. And then when it comes to persuasion, I mean, what I try to talk about is I try to talk about like, we don't want to reward Blackstone. We want to reward mom and pop landlords. And we want to make sure they have enough. We want them to be first in line. I do want to be really real that while some mom and pop landlords are less likely to raise the rent, more likely to be in community with their renters, some of them also really suck. And so we tend to use it as a stand-in for like, you are a good person because you have a name and a face in the community, but that's shorthand. And I think over time, we're going to have to get more precise. The more power we build as a left, we're going to have to get more precise about like this question and like what it really means.
Thank you. Okay. Next we'll have Doug.
Hi, that was a great presentation. As the various moratoria expire, we're likely to face some kind of, as you mentioned, some kind of foreclosure and eviction crisis. And as you also mentioned, the private equity guys are licking their chops, about to become classic predators in the way they're so accomplished at. What kinds of strategies do we have to fight them? And I'm wondering if you've seen this proposal that came out of a group at NYU to create a social housing development authority to buy up distressed properties and convert them into social housing. How do you feel about that?
I think it is a great idea. And I think we should do it. And I think now is the moment to do it because the housing will go to the private equity companies or it could come to us. But I think that as we do it, we should be cognizant of and aware and really organized and disciplined about the challenges that it could create if you just become basically like a landlord overnight. We need to learn from what happened to the CBOs in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s and the cooperators in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s, and also NYCHA, and organize so that the outcomes look a little bit different. But we have to do it. I mean, now is the opportunity. And I think that there's some legislation, there's a couple pieces of legislation in the New York State legislature right now that would create the opportunity for that to happen, including a Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act that Marcella Mateins, who's our socialist state legislature from South Brooklyn, is supporting and it's sponsoring. But we have to be real that like a lot of if social housing is existing sort of alongside capitalism, the operators of social housing are going to be subject to the same rules as housing under capitalism. And so we just have to be constantly organized to demand the resources, get the resources, and then also weaken systematically the real estate industry through things like rent control. I mean, a community land trust is just a legal entity. Anyone could be on the board of the community land trust, including like every single for-profit affordable housing provider in the city.
Okay, next we have Jeremy.
Yeah, thanks, Cea. I feel scared by Obi's warning because I have like 12 questions, so I'm gonna try and only ask one-ish. I guess you ended with the Biden stuff, and I think I'm really glad you mentioned that because I feel like it's not so often that we get a really clear, like, what's the word? Sort of I don't know, a signal as to kind of what's coming on the federal level. And we do have it with the infrastructure bill. And I'm wondering like what that means for the kinds of demands the left can put forward that are, you know, given the actual existing political circumstances are like, non-reformist reforms that are plausible enough that they can be organizing tools that they can kickstart the housing movement in places where it's not as strong. That what do those demands look like? What are the federal kinds of organizing that we can hope to do?
Yeah, I think first, I like NYCHA is in crisis, and the thing that we need to do to save NYCHA is we need a lot of federal money. So the Green New Deal for NYCHA, it needs to be a critical component of the Biden infrastructure demand. And it's a challenge because there isn't really public housing across the rest of the country. So building the political block for public housing has been basically impossible in Washington. So Schumer has to deliver that, basically. Like, he has to do it now. After that, the Biden administration is likely to invest, millions and billions of dollars into rental assistance. Rental assistance without conditions on the money is just a landlord giveaway. So rental assistance without rent control. What we really need to fight for, if we're going to have a universal Section 8 program, in order to prevent that from being just a massive landlord giveaway, it needs to also come with a universal tenants bill of rights that includes rent controls and includes a right to organize and includes a commitment to things like source of income discrimination that actually give tenants control and power over their homes. And so we don't just want money and investment, we also want power, and we want like a commitment to organizing. And then the third thing that Doug mentioned is this idea of acquiring distressed real estate and holding it in the public domain. Now is a moment to do that. If Biden is serious about investing trillions of dollars in millions of new housing units, some of that is going to be upgrades and preservation. Some of that, like, who's going to be in control of that development? And can it be an organized tenant movement that is organized because they have the right to organize? Or is it going to be, Ron Moelis, the biggest for-profit affordable housing provider who makes billions of dollars off the provision of low-income housing? It's really important, I think, to name that the affordable housing industry, both the real estate industry is a huge industry, of course, we all know that, but the affordable housing industry is an immensely valuable industry where, it's not a problem of austerity in housing. We're spending really billions and billions and billions of dollars in housing development programs and housing preservation programs in New York City and New York State and across the country. It's a question of like who's in control of the resources, and the only way we change that is through organizing. It's no coincidence that that the for-profit affordable housing developers get every little thing they want from the federal government, state government, or local government, including like monthly rents that to them look like $6,000 a month, but to the tenant look like 30% of your income, and NYCHA isn't getting shit. So we have to be real about like who's going to be in control.
I'm going to go ahead and put myself on stack for one of my questions. We had one of our former guests was delving deeply into a few of the policy items for, I believe, the Tax the Rich campaign. And one of the topics that came up was the idea of increasing taxes on inherited wealth. And he made the valid point that the vast majority of people who are inheriting property as a form of wealth are not people of color, but there are some. And I wasn't really satisfied with his answer that with the increased one, focusing on taxing that, the solution would be if they can't sell their property, their taxes would be waived until they could sell it. But the idea is to not sell it for many of us who are inheriting wealth from our parents, and they worked really hard to, get housing, which is often a significant barrier for Black people and other people of color. So I'm curious what your thoughts are about whether or not something needs to be sacrificed, or if you think this will be an area of contention within this movement if that becomes something that a lot of POCs who do inherit property feel that their personal wealth, I suppose, is attacked?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think it's like probably the top challenge facing our movement. So I'm going to start with the question of good cause eviction as a sort of an example, because I think it's helpful. Good cause eviction still allows you to raise. So one of the, for some context, one of the things that is often leveled against good cause eviction is that it's protecting white gentrifiers in Bed-Stuy. And they are renting from POC homeowners who fought really hard to get a toehold in Bed-Stuy when everyone else abandoned it. And by trying to regulate those units now, what we're doing is attacking Black wealth building. After centuries of being locked out of the housing market, now Black folks have $1 million brownstones in Bed-Stuy, and all of a sudden, what are we going to do? Rent control it? So that's an argument, and that is a compelling argument, especially to a lot of people in the state legislature. And so what we like to do is we like to talk through it. Like, no, we're not saying that. Good cause is really about a landlord-tenant code of conduct. Most of the provisions in good cause you're probably abiding with anyway. And the reality is that what good cause is going to do is it's going to prevent you from raising the rent to a skyrocketing level, but it's not going to prevent you from evicting tenants who are breaking the terms of the lease. It's not even going to prevent you from raising the rent on an apartment to pay for like your cost. So if you put on a new roof, you can raise the rent. So we'll have that conversation. I think the reality is that for centuries, we've really treated property as an individualized good and not a collective good. And we are going to transitioning to treating it as a collective good and towards a model of shared equity will require that we think about it differently. And it will mean that families, especially white families, but some POC families who are homeowners as well, are going to have a different relationship to property than the one that we currently have. But I guess what I would say is, like, on the whole, we are not moving to a place of no equity and no wealth in property. We are moving to a place of a more sort of fair and balanced and shared collective wealth in the property market. And so it's really a question of who's in control. Farah talks about this really well, better than I do. And she says, who here really wants to be a millionaire? And the truth is no one wants to be a millionaire. They want stability. They want to know that they're going to be able to take care of their kids. They're going to want to know that if they have to leave their home, their family members and their loved ones aren't going to have to leave their home. And so that's really what we're talking about. We're talking about not taking wealth out of the property market entirely. We're talking about really keeping it in the community rather than, this is sort of, now I'm sort of just rambling, rather than sort of transitioning it into like Blackstone and the corporate developers who are trying to take it. So yeah, it's going to be different. Yeah, it's going to be, yes, there is going to be some shared sacrifice, but I think overall, we'll get more for it in the end.
Thank you. Next, we're going to have Rob.
Hi. My question is, so my understanding of the success, a big part of the success of like universal rent control fight in 2019 was that there was this really strong like upstate downstate coalition bringing together people from across the state who all rented. And you mentioned that, like, you know, when you move to canceling rent, the coalition starts to fray, or other coalitions start to fray. I was wondering if, yes, a few other related posters do, like Fiona Apple. But I was wondering, like, do you believe that, I guess, how has the coalition upstate downstate shifted when you bring the campaign to cancel rent as opposed to universal rent control? And do you feel like it has that same strength? Why or why not?
Yeah, it's been hard. I think one of the ways in which it's shifted is it's like always sort of like a spectrum of like more established community-based organizations or more of sort of like social movement groups. Cancel Rent is definitely a lot more reliant on social movement groups than it is on these sort of longstanding neighborhood CBOs, and the Universal Rent Control campaign was. And you see those tensions across the state as well. I mean, there are people who will tell you that cancel rent has no traction in upstate New York because we're all homeowners here and it feels polarizing. But then I think the reason why we're winning anything on the cancel rent campaign is because of the Black Lives Matter moment in Rochester, New York, the deep, deep uprising of Black renters organizing against, you know, white landlords in Rochester, which is a city in upstate New York, where a New York State Assembly member was arrested blocking a tenant from facing eviction in late December. And so the character of the movement being upstate and downstate still exists. I would say there's a changing organizational composition, but overall the movement is growing deeply. And it's exciting, but it's also a little bit scary because it's new ground. We definitely have like more groups that are sort of unfoundation funded and less tied to the political establishment who are more active than ever before. But I think that that's like a good thing. The crop of new tenant union organizing either at the building level or through organizations like DSA that are fully independent and fully member funded is a healthy development, even if it means that there have been some growing pains.
Okay, Bran?
Thanks so much for that talk, Cea. It's brilliant. So this sort of leads on from Mia's question, sort of around persuasion. I'm thinking a lot about like, what do we tell people who've been like really accustomed to trying to build wealth, especially through home and land ownership, but wealth is a solve, frankly, to death through poverty, right? You know, we were talking about how like we don't have those universal programs yet, right? To care for people so that they aren't too poor to live. So when we're you know, home ownership is not just a goal for a lot of these people, but there's an emotional link to that, right? It's kind of, you know, and it's an emotional link that's really a supportive thing through living through capitalism. And so how do we unbraid that? Like, you know, home ownership is sort of has been for decades, right? The whole key to living here. And I know so many people that are just, you know, they're just attached to that idea as like, and it's attached because of the fear ultimately. So what do you suggest we do as kind of a movement, as we organize amongst friends, relatives, everyone? Yeah, how do we do that?
And people crave stability too, right? Like it's about fear, it's about stability for the long term. So I don't have a really good answer. I have something that would further complicate it and maybe just like some suggestions. The first is that all of those services also rely on property taxes, especially at the local level, which is just like a further wrinkle that is so, it poses this challenge, right? Because like you want all these things, but in order to get these things, we are actually relying on gentrification, right? I want my neighborhood to gentrify, so my property tax, I don't want it. But like once you become a homeowner, you want your neighborhood to gentrify so that your schools improve, and your schools are improving when the neighborhood gentrifies because the property taxes are going up. And that's what you're using to fund your school. And this is less true in New York City. It's true in like the suburbs or in a smaller city where it looks a little bit different in a school system like ours. But the reality is that property taxes funding our educational system and property taxes being very, very linked to home ownership is just a further wrinkle to your question, I think, because we don't have those social programs yet. I guess what I would say is that we need to get involved in campaigns like the Ione campaign that lead to a big transfer of wealth to the people at the very top. And so not continuing to rely on pretty regressive taxes that like put us in the bind that I just described, in order to both raise the money to fund the programs that we want. So that's the first thing, is getting involved in campaigns to raise the revenue that we need, because it's there and it's just being captured at the top, in a real fundamental way. And I don't know much about MMT. I'm not an expert on that. So I would punt that question, but I'm happy to learn. I'm eager to learn because I know it's something that keeps coming up. And then the second thing that I would argue is that we can have all of the things that you described, like long-term stability and equity building and control over our home for ourselves and the generation below us, and the generation below them, through a different ownership model, like a shared equity model. Those models are very difficult when they are niche, which is sort of what you see with some of the smaller HDFCs. They like struggle for resources and they struggle to compete. But they're incredibly successful when they are fully funded and when the state really commits to them. So there's examples of that. Co-op City is a great example of that. Penn South is a great example of that. Neither of these are perfect, right? But we can have the things that we want if we commit to organizing for them with the tools that we have right now.
Lyric?
Hi guys, how are you? Speaking of taxes, I've been going through 421A taxes, and what a mess. Oh my God. You know, there's some of these guys are paying about $85 a year in taxes, all while not being in compliance with the 421A rules. But that wasn't my question. That just kind of set me off when you were talking about taxes, and I've been going through them. My question is about DHCR, because I'm in the trenches here, and I can't walk down the street without seeing someone getting screwed out of their rent stabilized building. And right around the corner, I organized it. We got TPU in there. We got them refunds and stuff, and then they all moved out. And now he's back to the same crap. DHCR doesn't really take complaints from other people. They will tell you, you don't live in the building, you don't have standing, you know, and in my view, that's like seeing a building on fire and being like, well, I'm sorry, I couldn't contact anyone who lived in the building to call the fire department, and just letting it burn. That kind of, all right, it really just pisses me off. So my question is, how do we get around an agency that really has no compunction about losing affordable housing just because of redundant amounts of paperwork or their ridiculously antiquated system?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to say that we can't, but I do want to say that the reason HCR is the way that it is because it is been set up that way by both like our governor, but by decades of austerity and the way that we have intentionally built in a defunding of public institutions. So I actually think it's no different from what's happening at NYCHA, and no different from what's happening at CUNY, and no different from what's happening with the MTA. And so we've done a really good job at defunding institutions that are supposed to work for people, so much to the point that they no longer work, so much to the point that working people don't even believe in them anymore.
They don't function.
And so I think that the challenge for the left is that we need to learn how to run those agencies. And this is this is sort of like, it's really great that we have people in the legislature. We need to, for our political project long term, I think we need to be able to say that if a socialist ran the New York State government, all the people who worked at HCR would be compassionate and it would look different and it would be well funded and it would be well oiled. And like, we actually need, there's a really great article. Sorry, this is like an aside, right? But like, we don't actually know how, the left doesn't actually know how to govern, right? All we know is bureaucracy, but we actually need to become like the best and most well-oiled and most compassionate and welcoming bureaucrats. There's a really good article about DHCR's inefficiencies that I recommend people read. And at the end of the article, Senator Liz Krueger says, like, everybody thinks that like it's some scandal and that there is like a big corruption scandal where the real estate agent or the real estate developers are like giving HCR people like bags of cash. And it's not that, it's just standard bureaucratic inefficiencies. And so I'm like, I think that is like the classic like liberal quote is like, oh, there's no scandal. It's just, you know, government. And that's the problem, right? That is the scandal. Scandals and corruptions don't really look like bags of cash. It doesn't look like Ron Moelis giving like, you know, the HCR commissioner like a bag of unmarked cash to ignore tenant complaints. What corruption actually looks like is like a lot more boring than that. And it looks like the housing agency that's meant to protect tenants being completely destroyed through death by 1,000 paper cuts. And at the same time, Buffalo Billions and these massive $1 trillion infrastructure programs that are running through a completely different non-union agency. Yeah. So I don't have a really good answer for how to deal with HCR in the day-to-day, other than the squeakiest wheel tends to get the most grease. And so the commitment to organizing is the most effective way to cut through it that I've found so far. Getting your state legislators involved, protesting, media, the classic tools, those can be helpful. But the broader question that you're pointing to, I think, is the most pressing question that I feel coming off of the Cancel Rent campaign and the Tax the Rich campaign, which is like, what's our theory of how to run the government going to be? And how are we going to make sure it doesn't look the same way that it looks right now? Yeah. Because it is deeply corrupt. Like Liz Krueger is wrong. It is, and it's not corrupt in like a boring, it's not corrupt in an exciting way. It's just planned to fail, and we have to be better than that. So we have to learn how to run. I don't know if anyone wants to be HCR commissioner once Jabari is governor.
I can do it. You know, at this point I would do it. I've dealt with DHCR for 6 years. It's like they can't even document a foyer heater. It's dysfunctional to the point of non-functioning. And you're right, it's intentional. And it's not like I'm getting paid, so I'm doing all this. It's just, well, I don't have to do this, so I'm just going to let it go. You didn't give me enough paperwork, you didn't do enough of that. But, you know, we could streamline all of that. And
and I think it's not intentional on the point of any one person. It's intentional on the part of the political project of a neoliberal, like centrist democratic state. It's not like Andrew Cuomo is like, you know, it would be great as if I defunded HCR. It's that he like literally doesn't believe in it. Like there's like a deep ideological belief that like the state cannot effectively regulate housing, and that the project is to like prove that wrong through a commitment to organize. That's the state and the people, right? Because it's a combination, because you need that democracy, that the state and the people cannot effectively self-govern. So we need private industry to like come in and take care of that part for us. And we need to pay them to do it. And so it's a commitment to organizing that we need to make together in order to prove that self-governance is possible, that shared equity is possible, that a government that's responsive to the needs of the working class is possible, and we could have that if we wanted to. But I think it's not like, nobody is like, oh yeah, like I hate tenants, so I'm gonna like slow roll HCR. It's just not a priority, you know?
Yeah, it needs to be.
Yeah.
Thanks.
We're gonna have Lee.
Okay, so I'm going to ask a two-part question, even though there's a limit. So you have talked about a social control of equity as a product of organizing, basically. But I think it's hard to do that without pointing to some vehicle or some model of a vehicle about that. And in the face of, do we have that or not, we're looking at public housing that's totally failing, and that generations upon generations of New Yorkers have fought for, and now they're selling it off, giving it away to real estate interests, basically a piece at a time. And, to me, that should be the priority, is to get in there and go through the things that have been won by years and years of organizing and shore it up, make it work, make it happen, take it away from the real estate people, give it back to the tenants, and build from there. So I'm just wondering how we can do that, how we can undermine the need to give it to the real estate interests.
Yeah, I mean, so one, I think like really pushing, there's two problems. One is funding and one is governance. And the funding problem is a problem that needs to be solved at the state and the federal level. It can sort of be solved at the local level, but not really. And then the question of governance is really real, right? Like the residents are not organized in a unified opposition to privatization. Residents are fucking fed up with public housing, and they don't feel like they're in control. They don't feel like it's democratic, because it's not. And so, yes, we need to block privatization, but to me, blocking privatization means really getting serious about organizing NYCHA. And we don't want to just fight privatization as leftists, though we do want to do that. We want to fight it grounded in a vision for what public housing that was democratically run by the residents who lives there looks like. And if you asked, like, if you got a room full of 50 NYCHA residents, I would say that probably like 33% of them would be fully opposed to RAD. 33% of them would support it because they hate NYCHA, and 33% of them would be like, actually, no, 10% would be fully opposed, 10% would welcome it, and 80% would be like, what's that? And to me, that's like the fundamental problem. RAD is the program to privatize public housing. And so the problem of NYCHA residents not trusting NYCHA to spend, if NYCHA got all the money tomorrow, NYCHA residents don't trust NYCHA to spend the money. And that problem's not going away with a lot more money. So figuring out how to bring democracy to the public housing agency is, I think, what's going to make the money that I hope comes, which I think we need to organize to come, like sustainable. NYCHA needs a political voice. It doesn't have one. All it has is these like sham resident councils that are just vestiges of like a machine that is completely tied to real estate. And honestly, like, sorry, not to keep talking, DSA is not well positioned to be that voice right now. We're just not. We need NYCHA there is a NYCHA DSA working group of DSA members who are NYCHA residents. They are getting organized. It is really exciting. I think that's a kind of political project that DSA should be investing in and supporting. And I was like, what if we tried to organize a NYCHA working group and run a bunch of DSA NYCHA members for like the NYCHA resident, they have they have tenant associations in NYCHA that are just totally defunct, basically. What if we tried to take over like 5 resident associations at like 5 developments through supporting NYC DSA members who are NYCHA residents and like running for TA president? Like that would be a pretty cool use of our skills, right? Like both a lot of canvassing and GOTV and like a deep commitment to public institutions. It could be cool. So yeah, I agree with you. The how is important to me, and not having it just be like us is important to me. I also think the rank and file work is exciting, including like DC 37 Progressives, which is a caucus in DC 37 that a bunch of DSA members have started. A lot of DC 37 members work in NYCHA, so that's another sort of way in.
That's amazing. I did not know we had a NYCHA group. That's fucking amazing. I think Jeremy, did you have one more question you wanted to tie in? You put it in the chat somewhere.
Yeah. Oh gosh, I forget. I had like a million questions. I guess maybe one quick thing is like so you said that, cancel rent, even though it's not successful likely in actually canceling the rent, may have like long-term fruits, and just like what it revealed about these fissures in the larger movement and kind of what we can learn from that, and also B, in terms of getting some relief, and then C, maybe longer term fruits. And I guess speaking maybe somewhat self-interestedly as someone who has a tenants association that organized because of the pandemic and because of like with cancel rent as a demand, like how do we basically like take infrastructure that was built out of this moment and lead it to survive? What kind of demands? I mean, I'm thinking, I guess there's a sense in which shifting to good cause makes a lot of sense in terms of growing the tenant movement, but I would guess that a lot of the most active tenants associations to come out of this moment are actually probably already in rent stabilized buildings like mine, where people felt especially emboldened in this period because A, you have legal protections on top of just the general nobody can pay the rent, eviction moratorium, et cetera. So yeah, what kind of demands can build new organizations that have emerged out of this moment?
Yeah. I mean, the cool thing is that a lot of the tenant unions that are on rent strike right now are sort of jointly negotiating both with the state and with the landlord, which is pretty cool. And so sort of committing to the work of organizing at the building level is very important, and demands around repairs or like control over where you live and like life with some like your ability to make decisions over what your building looks like. Like I know, Jeremy, we've talked about whether or not your landlord's going to let you keep your bike in the hallway. Like that's actually like why people want to become homeowners, because like they don't want to fight with some random ass person about where to put their bike, honestly. Right. And so, I mean, it's a lot more complicated than that, but that is like part of the reason. Right. And so I think demands about where we actually live that are targeted at, totally. Everyone has bike fights. Nobody likes bikes, except they're good and they're better than cars. But I think those are really important, like sort of conditions fights can really help maintain organization. And then I think moving on past that, are struggling. I mean, I think good cause is one thing that can help maintain organization, and I hope that it does. I think another is a broader and bigger vision for social housing and community control over the resources that exist. And I think continuing to fight, one lesson I think is that continuing to fight for demands that really make clear that there are people who are controlling the wealth, and that they by and large are not the tenants, and by and large not the working class, are the kinds of demands that we should be fighting for. So if it's blocking private equity from buying up a bunch of distressed housing so that we can buy it for ourselves, I think demands like that. Eliminating 421A could be that.
I did have one more question, and if anybody, I think we still have a little bit of time, so if anyone else wants to get on stack. I'm often thinking about like housing in the context of economic development. You mentioned gentrification, so just the idea of like how do we develop cities in a more ethical, leftist, progressive way. Are there other things that are happening right now that kind of support this effort for housing in that vein of developing our city in a more leftist leaning or a more progressive way? Or if they're not happening right now, are there certain things that you think would be realistic in the near future to support that kind of collective goal?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the Green New Deal for NYCHA is like a huge part of that. Protecting NYCHA is critical to a more stable infrastructure for our city. And then I think the various campaigns around community opportunity to purchase and tenant opportunity to purchase are also good examples. And then finally, the sort of work that the housing working group in NYC DSA is trying to do some work about what are the actions it would take at a city, state, and a federal level to expand social housing in New York. And I think we need to stop thinking about we need to like put some meat on the bones of what it would mean to be in control of the development and the preservation of affordable housing that we control. Not just trying to block development, but actually control it ourselves. And that, I think, is the next struggle that we have to answer as the left. We're really, really good at blocking Industry City, at blocking or shifting the terms of the debate at the Bedford Armory, or blocking Amazon from coming to New York. We're like really, really, we've gotten quite good at saying no. We need to figure out what it would mean to be like, we're saying no because we want to do this.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much. We're going to close Stack now and pass it on to Jeremy. Thank you everyone for your comments.
Oh, and I want to say also Camilla's comment in the Stack. That's exactly what I was going to say. Our next DSA Housing Working Group meeting is Brooklyn. DSA Housing Working Group is on Monday, and a week from Monday. And you should definitely RSVP. I'll just drop it in the chat again.
Thank you so much, Cea. Unsurprisingly brilliant. And so I have just a couple brief announcements beyond that one for Housing Working Group. Everyone should go because there isn't night school next Monday. We only meet every 2 weeks. And 2 weeks from now, we have a night school on public education. We're very lucky to be joined for that one by Rebecca Gorelli, who is one of the main leaders of the Arizona teacher strike. One of the cool things about being on Zoom is we can talk to people in Arizona for our night school about Red for Ed and the teacher strikes of this last generation and kind of where the struggle for public education is going. So please come out for that. In terms of activism stuff for this week, we have Tax the Rich is in high gear. As everyone no doubt knows, but I'm going to drop a few links. There's a rally tomorrow. People are going up to Albany, so it might be actually too late to sign up for that. Maybe some people on this call, and we're still phone banking, especially Carl Hastie, the Speaker of the Assembly, and Andrea Stewart-Cousins, to put pressure on them to actually solidify the gains that have come in the One House budget and to push farther while we still have the chance. North Brooklyn on Thursday is doing a Tax the Rich town hall with Emily Gallagher. We are actually going to have, I believe, some NYCHA organizers speaking there, as well as AQE, the Alliance for Quality Education, and some Tax the Rich people on the campaign, as well as Emily. So please spread the word. We're hoping that this is a good way to tie in, especially people who live in Emily's district. Invite your neighbors, invite your friends. That's on Thursday. It's an easy bit.ly to sign up. The last thing is, if people are interested in the chat, this kind of came up in our poly-ed discussion. If in a few weeks, I think in a month from now, we're having Vince Bevins, who wrote the Jakarta Method, to talk about imperialism. And some of us were thinking like, boy, we would really like to read that book, but we haven't gone to yet. And wouldn't it be nice to like meet up maybe some weekend outside and talk about that book before he comes? Because it's very readable and short, and we could give ourselves a deadline. If anyone would be interested in doing something like that, a little not on the beaten path of night school, just like pop off in the chat, like maybe I'd read Jakarta Method. We just wanted to gauge interest if we plan something like that. And those are all my announcements. Again, thanks to everybody for coming. Ooh, there does seem to be real interest. So maybe like the weekend after next or something was what some of us were thinking, but we can, yeah, we can definitely get back to people. I'm writing down names here. Brilliant. Again, thank you so much, Cea. Really, really appreciate it. And have a great night, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.